Something to be said for that. But we are continuing to work our way through the Gospel of John, both in sermons and in small groups, because if we did it just in sermons, it would last even longer than it's going to last. But it's going to be good. It's going to be fun. We've made it all the way, by the end of today, we'll have made it through chapter 2, so that's pretty good progress, I think. Now, this week in small groups, if you're part of a small group, you discussed Jesus' first miracle, the changing of the water into wine. So if you were part of a small group, I'm kind of curious, what was your main takeaway from that miracle? What did you sort of discover from that discussion? Anybody part of a small group discussion this week about that? It's not like an either-or thing. You come on Sunday or you go to a small group. So, anyone? Good. Good. Yes?
Yeah, we were talking a bit about how it was just pretty cool that his first entrance into ministry was really in something that seemed unplanned for him, and that was really partly in response to his mom's request, like something that mattered to her, at a celebration for someone else. Like, so it was really just about like celebrating community and other people, and Mom asked me to, so sure. We ran out of stuff to continue this like celebration, and that's important to me. And I just thought that was really cool, because it doesn't seem super spiritual, and it doesn't seem super like self-promotional, you know? So
Right.
we just thought that was really revealing.
That's cool, yeah. So it was this kind of unselfish act in response to the power of Mom. It was the stuff of everyday life, right? It was just an everyday occurrence. I like that about that story. Anyone else have any insights from your... Yeah.
Kind of along the same lines, but we thought that I thought it was kind of showing like that God really supports us to come together as a community and celebrate and to have fun. Like it seems maybe trivial in the grand scheme of what's happening in the world, but it seemed like that's an important thing to God.
Yeah.
And it makes him happy to see us be joyous together.
Yeah. So this idea that God's not against us having fun, that he's part of that, and even in this case supported it with, did anybody calculate how much wine it would have been?
No.
I think I put that as a question. Would it? A lot?
I think we felt like $4,000 or $5,000 worth of wine.
$4,000 or $5,000 worth of wine in today's wine values. So, would someone do me a favor and shut that blind right there? There's like a piercing ray of sun shining off of that vehicle. Can you see it on my face? Because I can feel it. I'd like to keep my sight. Thank you. So a very, very cool, different kind of miracle. Different than healing people. Different than walking on water. But like very much a part of this joyous community celebration. And it is. I think it says something. And I think John intentionally writes this book about the Word of God, who was in the beginning, who was with God, who created everything, this light of the world that brings life to everyone, who came to earth, and the very first miracle he performed was making more wine because the wine had run out at a wedding. There's something weird about that, right? But beautiful weird, good weird. And so now we're going to go on this week into John's description of an event that we call the cleansing of the temple. But, as we will do for most weeks, at least for the first part of this series, I want to first give you another sort of tip or hint to studying the Bible. Last week I talked about what's called Ignatian gospel reading, where you put yourself into the passage imaginatively. Use the right side of your brain, the creative, sort of imaginative side. But this week I want to talk a little bit about using the left side of your brain, the more systematic, logical side, because I think both sides of your brain are important when you're studying the Bible. And today I just want to give you a 3-step process or 3 questions that can guide the process of studying the Bible, okay? And these 3 steps are observation, interpretation, and application. And even if you don't remember those words, I want you to remember the 3 questions that go along with it. Observation is, what does it say? what does the passage actually say? Now, this might seem like kind of a no-brainer, like, well, I just read the passage, now I know what it says. Often, the first time we read through a passage, especially at a normal reading pace, we miss a lot of what's in there. We miss a lot of what it's actually saying because maybe we don't know the context, we don't know the meaning of some words. And so stopping to say what does it, or to ask what does it say, is stopping to very carefully observe the passage and to read it a little more closely, a little more carefully, and make sure we really understand what it's saying before we jump to the next part, which is interpretation. And the question to ask there is, what does it mean? So when you're asking what does it mean, you're asking questions of principles. You're asking like, okay, what kind of principles is this passage teaching us about God, about humanity, about ourselves, about the way the world works, about the kingdom, about Jesus? What are the big principles that it's kind of teaching that I can pull out of it? And this is a place to be very careful because sometimes we make logical leaps. Like, for instance, a lot of what the Bible gives us is descriptive. It describes events that happened. It doesn't put its blessing on them. It doesn't necessarily say they shouldn't have happened. They just happened. A bad leap to take is to move in this interpretation thing would be to move from a description to a prescription. So prescribing means this is what we should do. It happened, therefore we should do it. That could be a very dangerous thing in the Bible because the Bible describes life as it actually happened, not as it always should be. And so you can't make leaps from just a descriptive passage to necessarily, therefore we should always do this. But when we are careful to read what it says, there will be, in most passages, this active interpretation to go, okay, what are we learning here? What's this trying to teach us about God, about life, about ourselves? And then finally, application. And the question to ask there is, what does it mean to me? And so this is about going, okay, now what do I do with this? How do I apply it to my life? How do I make it real? How do I make it actionable? And this is a really important step that we don't always get to. And yet, what I would argue is that this is the purpose of the Bible. That the purpose of the Bible is not to somehow become this theological puzzle we have to figure out, or some people like to use the Bible and pull together all the prophecies and figure out the end times, and it's like God's given us this, 6,000-piece puzzle where we need to put every piece in place and figure out the world and what's going to happen, and then we know. Then we have knowledge that nobody else has. Actually, what 2 Timothy 3:16 says is that the Scriptures were given to us because they're useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness. In other words, they're meant to be put into practice. They're meant to affect our lives. They're meant to help transform us. And so that's just simply a 3-step process you can go through. Personally, these questions are what help me rather than the actual names of the process. So when I think about it, I think of, okay, what does it say? What does it mean? What does it mean to me? What does it say? What does it mean? What does it mean to me? And that's just a good sort of process to guide your logical, systematic study of the Bible in terms of more of that left brain study. Combining that with the imagination, with the creative right brain, I think leads to a much more holistic version of studying the Bible. I want to take us through today's passage, which is found in John 2:13 to 24. And then I'm going to take us through the process of going through each of those, which, by the way, is the process that I use pretty much every week when I'm preaching. Not always quite as systematically as I will this week, but this is the process of when I go to the Scriptures and I want to bring to you what they say, there's a process of going, okay, what can I do to clarify what it's saying? What kind of things can I pull out that it means? And then how do we actually take it and apply it to our lives? So, now you can be a pastor. John 2, starting in verse 13, it says this: "It was nearly time for the Jewish Passover celebration. So Jesus went to Jerusalem. In the temple area, he saw merchants selling cattle, sheep, and doves for sacrifice. He also saw dealers at tables exchanging foreign money. Jesus made a whip from some ropes and chased them all out of the temple. He drove out the sheep and cattle, scattered the money changers' coins over the floor, and turned over their tables. Then, going over to the people who sold doves, he told them, "Get these things out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a marketplace." Then his disciples remembered this prophecy from the scriptures, "Passion for God's house will consume me." But the Jewish leaders demanded, "What are you doing? If God gave you authority to do this, show us a miraculous sign to prove it." "All right," Jesus replied, "destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." "What?" they exclaimed. "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you can rebuild it in 3 days?" But when Jesus said this temple, he meant his own body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed both the scriptures and what Jesus had said. Because of the miraculous signs Jesus did in Jerusalem at the Passover celebration, many began to trust in him. But Jesus didn't trust them because he knew human nature. No one needed to tell him what mankind is really like. So there we go. An interesting passage, an interesting sort of flow here. Let's start off thinking about what it says. Now, to understand what it's saying, there are some key words to look into to really understand what they mean. Okay? Most of the info today that I'm going to give you could be gotten from the study notes in this little study Bible thing here. And if you didn't get one of those yet, there's plenty more back by the offering box on the chair there. Okay? And this is just a little tool that I've handed out for this series to help you understand that a study Bible can be a very good tool to help you understand what's going on here. So I looked at the notes, and I have come up with some stuff to share with you to better understand what it's saying, making some observations. So the first word we might get to where we go, what's that? Is Passover. So the Passover is this important annual festival within Judaism that commemorated when God delivered them out of Egypt, when God took them out of Egypt. And when he did that, he told them to sacrifice a lamb, to eat it there in their house, and to put the blood on their doorposts. And that blood would symbolize that they were set aside, that they were set apart. And when the angel of death came for the 10th plague on Egypt, he would know to pass over their house because of the blood. Now, that's a message that spoke to their national identity. It spoke to God's choosing them and rescuing them and bringing them out of Egypt. And so it's a very important festival. It also foreshadows what would happen through Jesus. If you remember, just a couple verses ago, John had stood there and said, "Look, it's the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." And so there's a little bit of a tie-in here with the Passover. But how the Passover worked at this point is that it was a one-day festival followed then by a full week festival called the the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And so thousands and thousands of Jews would come back to Jerusalem, their sort of capital city, for this festival. So it'd be like Muskoka on Civic Holiday, okay? The population of Jerusalem would have tripled, quadrupled. Now, the reason that all these people came back for Passover was because Jerusalem was the site of the temple, which is the next word that we should look into a little bit here. The temple was the center of worship for Judaism. Now, they might have had synagogues in all their towns in the same way we have churches, in local communities, but there was only one temple, and that was the only place where these sacrifices could be offered on the altar there in the way that God had commanded. Now, the first temple had been built by King Solomon about 1,000 years before this, so the temple was nothing new to them. But that one had been destroyed and then rebuilt in kind of a smaller way about 500 years before it had been destroyed. And then if you read in the book of Ezra, it talks about this remnant that rebuilds the temple. But that temple was kind of smaller, not as good. It went along for quite a while. But about 20 years before Jesus was born, Herod the Great That's the same Herod that the Magi met with, the wise men met with, that tried to kill the baby Jesus. About 20 years before Jesus was born, Herod the Great began a remodeling project of this temple. And he expanded it, and he beautified it, and he made it into what was one of surely the wonders of the ancient world at the time. And so he created this humongous temple facility. He had a couple reasons for this. He was the ruler of the Jews at the time. He wanted to sort of leave a lasting legacy by which he would be remembered. So he was building this temple to God kind of as a monument to himself. I hate to see what kind of parallels would be there in the world today. But he also knew that these festivals were very important economically. And so he wanted the temple to be able to accommodate a lot of people. So a small sort of Ezra-type temple didn't do it. He wanted it big. So lots of people could come back. Lots of people could pay taxes. Lots of people could support his economy there. So, by the way, the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem is the only sort of remnant of this temple today. It's one of the most holy sites in Judaism. It actually was destroyed in about AD 70. So it only, he did the renovation, and then it wasn't long before it was all torn down. And that Western Wall is kind of what still remains. Now, I want to show you a little 3D model of what it may have looked like. So here's kind of how it looks. If you look at kind of the top right, there's a place called the Holy Place. This is where the incense is offered. This is where there's a lamp going all the time. And in the very back sort of inner portion of that is the most holy place where no one's allowed to enter, where the presence of God is said to rest. Okay, if you come forward from that, the big sort of porch there, there's the altar where the sacrifices are offered. And all that part in there, the people of Israel and the priests were allowed to go to and watch these sacrifices and pray and worship and draw near to God. But the whole big sort of court outside there is called the court of the Gentiles. The reason for this is because there was a sign basically that said if a Gentile comes into this Jewish portion, a non-Jew comes in there, they'll be put to death. But they're welcome to come into that outer sort of circle there, because Gentiles were often curious about the Jewish religion, about this one God that the Jews talked about. It was very different from their Roman sort of understanding of multiple gods and just add a god here and there. And so there was curiosity. So Gentiles would come and they would draw near to sort of see this God or approach this God. And so that's kind of what it looked like. We know this from the writings of Josephus, who was a Jewish historian. He describes what it's like. Now, when Jesus came, what he encountered was that whole big outside courtyard, the court of the Gentiles, had been turned into a marketplace. He came in there, and there are money-changing booths, and if you can imagine the sounds of people selling cattle and sheep and doves. Now, don't get me wrong, there would have been the sounds of livestock in the temple anyway, because animal sacrifice was a big deal. But all of these people selling, changing money. He walks into this court of the Gentiles, and it's like a shopping mall. Now, I want to be clear why those people are there. That's kind of the third thing to look at, is to go, okay, who are these money changers and sellers of cattle and sheep and doves? What are they doing there? Well, here's the deal. With all these people traveling in, first of all, there was a temple tax. Everyone above 20 had to pay a temple tax. It helped support the building projects and the ongoing maintenance of the temple. This was important. This was like paying your tithe, I guess, at the temple. There was a certain amount you had to pay, but you had to pay it in the local currency. And so the money changers were there to help you, if you traveled from afar, change your foreign currency into the local currency so you could pay the tax, because this was important. This was an aspect of worship as well. So they weren't doing anything bad. They were providing a service. It was the same with the sellers of cattle and sheep and doves. You came and you were supposed to offer an animal sacrifice. Well, it can get kind of weird bringing a cow on a journey with you, right? or a sheep even, or even a dove, like I guess you would bring that on a string or something. I don't know. There were extra baggage charges for the airfare. There was all kinds of stuff they had to worry about. And so it was just a lot more convenient to buy the animal once you got there. So these people, too, were providing a service for people who had come to worship. There wasn't anything sort of innately bad about either one of them. So why is Jesus upset here? Well, what the passage says is not that he's upset at what they're doing. He's upset at where they're doing it. He's not upset that people are offering to exchange money. Now, in the Synoptic Gospels, the other Gospels, he does accuse them of making it a den of robbers, sort of implicating that they're ripping people off a bit, taking advantage of their worship. But he actually doesn't say anything about that here. What he says is, this isn't the place for this. See, those people wouldn't have been set up in the temple originally. They would have been set up in the Kidron Valley outside the temple area, and you could go and change your money and get your animal before you entered into the temple. But what had happened was, for convenience sake, they decided to move it right inside, into the court of the Gentiles. And I mean, who's going to use that anyway, right? They're just Gentiles. And so Jesus says, and he does a little play on words in the Greek, he says, you've turned my Father's house into a house of commerce or a house of business. This was meant to be God's dwelling, and you've turned it into a shopping mall, a marketplace. I don't know if you can sort of imagine coming into this sacred place that had been devoted to worship and prayer, to reaching out to God and to seeking him, and what it would have been like to just encounter a shopping mall there. And especially, one of the things we've talked about is how Jesus came as the light of the world. And it wasn't just to the Jews, but the prophecies had said that Jesus would be, the Messiah would be a light to the Gentiles. So here Jesus is coming to reach out to people who weren't Jewish by nationality or religion, and to shine a light for them. And this place within the temple, this court of the Gentiles that was prepared for them to come and draw near to God, has been turned into a marketplace. And so Jesus is displeased. So he gets some rope. I don't know, did he go to one of the market stalls and says, hey, I'd like some rope, please? And then he begins to craft a whip. However you do that, I guess probably multiple strands. And his disciples are going, hey, what you doing there? And they're like, he's got kind of a funny look in his eyes. What is going on? Is this an object lesson? Is he going to teach us something about the rope and the strands? And then, like a dam bursting, he goes off, right? I want you to really picture this for a moment, because sometimes we get the picture that Jesus is like the gentle shepherd with the lamb around his shoulders. And I know I've made this joke before, but did he have to set the lamb down before he started whipping, right? Like, let's really picture this. I want you to picture yourself in the temple, just kind of going about your business. You're coming to worship. You're going to buy your dove, whatever. And suddenly this guy comes in with a whip and starts whipping people, animals, things. He flips over some tables. The money is going rolling everywhere. Kids are running to get the coins, right? And he is shouting. He's saying, get these things out of here. Stop it. Stop turning my Father's house into a marketplace. What is your reaction to this? You're like, what's happening here? Who is this guy? And first of all, like, it's like 1 against, 50, 100? I don't know how many money changers and cattle people there were. He clearly has no fear, right? He is driving these people out. He's risking being accused of stirring up sedition or, a disturbance or whatever. He's risking the fact that all these money changers might turn on him. But he doesn't seem afraid. In fact, it's the money changers and the sellers of the cattle and doves and stuff that seem to have a bit of a look of panic in their eyes. They're freaking out a little bit. And so there's chaos. Do you think other people are shouting back at him? What are you doing? What is going on here? Who said you could do this? What are the disciples thinking? Right? They've only been following this guy for a little bit at this time. They've seen him make a bunch of wine. That was really cool. But now they're thinking, actually, my life as a fisherman wasn't so bad. This guy has lost it. What is going on here? So I don't know if that's all that they thought, but this really happened, and this was a real moment in the life of Jesus that is hard to fit in with the rest of our picture of him sometimes. So the religious leaders do show up and say, all right, what is going on here? Where do you get off? Who told you could do this? If God told you could do this, do a miracle, and then we'll believe it. And Jesus is like, in his mysterious way, I love the way that Jesus answers questions sometimes. He's like, okay, you want a miracle? I'll show you a miracle. Destroy this temple, and I'll raise it up again. I'll build it back in 3 days. And they're like, first of all, like, we're not going to destroy the temple just to see if you can do this. But second of all, it's taken us 46 years. That's from the time, like, when Herod started the renovation project to get through all this. And you're not going to do it in 3 days. You're nuts, buddy. This is just more proof that you're crazy. And the disciples also are scratching their heads. It says only later did they look back and go, oh, that's what he meant. Oh, he's right, 3 days, rose again after 3 days, temple is his body, got it, okay. Now, John ends the passage by implying that Jesus did some miracles during the festival. He doesn't tell us what they were, he doesn't say anything, but Jesus began to do miraculous signs and wonders and began to attract a following after this. But I like the way he ends. He's like, but Jesus knew better than to trust them. They trusted Jesus, but Jesus didn't trust them because Jesus knew what was going to be in people. And this is foreshadowing, right? Foreshadowing of the fact that people don't know what to do with Jesus, that they welcome him in as the king one Sunday, and then they're putting him to death on Friday. And throughout the book of John, there's going to be this tension that builds and builds with people going, oh, we really like him, and going, oh, but maybe we don't. See, the same Jesus who brings the wine is the Jesus who shows up with a whip. And so there is a tension in our human nature even today, I think. Sometimes going, I don't really know what to do with this Jesus. And John will build that and build that throughout his gospel because it built in the ministry of Jesus. So, I hope that helps us better understand what it's saying happened here. Now, what does it mean? What are some of the principles that we can see in the passage? What can we learn about God, Jesus, ourselves? I think a clue to kind of maybe one of the primary meanings here can be found in the traditional title of what this little section is called, and that is the cleansing of the temple. The cleansing of the temple. So there's an idea here that Jesus is purifying, that he cares about holiness, that the temple was meant to be a place set apart. That's the meaning of holiness, by the way. Holiness does not mean somehow perfectness. It means set apartness. And so the temple was meant to be set apart for the worship of God. It was meant to be dedicated to that. And here is this Word who was God, who created everything, who's the light of the world, through whom life comes to everyone. And he's becoming flesh, and he's living among us, and he's coming into the world. And one of the things he does is visit the temple where he's worshipped, and he says, this is not how it's supposed to be. He says, it is wrong to make the house of worship, the house of my Father, into a house of commerce. This isn't what I had in mind. You've taken it from its original purpose. This was meant to be a place where people could connect with God, a sacred place, and you've made it into a shopping mall. That's not the way it was supposed to be. And as the disciples remember, they're like, as they're trying to figure out how to describe what's going on here, well, there is a verse in the Bible that says you'd be passionate about God's house. So he's certainly being passionate right now. And Jesus is passionate about holiness, about things that are set apart remaining set apart. and not getting contaminated by other stuff. Things that are supposed to be dedicated to the worship of God, remaining that way, and not getting tied up with the stuff of the world around. Now, what came to mind is a passage from Malachi. If any of you are familiar with Handel's Messiah and force your kids and wife to watch it on Christmas like I do, much to their enjoyment, you may be familiar with this passage in kind of its King James Version because it's in Handel's Messiah. But let me read it to you in the New Living Translation we're using for this series. Malachi 3, starting at verse 1. It says, God is speaking. He says, "Look, I am sending my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me. Then the Lord you are seeking will suddenly come to his temple. The messenger of the covenant, whom you look for so eagerly, is surely coming, says the Lord of heaven's armies. But who will be able to endure it when he comes? Who will be able to stand and face him when he appears? For he will be like a blazing fire that refines metal, or like a strong soap that bleaches clothes. He will sit like a refiner of silver, burning away the dross. He will purify the Levites," those were the people who ministered in the temple, "refining them like gold and silver so that they may once again offer acceptable sacrifices to the Lord." So this prophecy says that there would be a messenger who would come and prepare the way for the Lord. Who's that? John the Baptist. Yeah, so already John has referred to John, the other John, John the Baptist, a few times as the one who came to prepare the way. So that part has come true. This is something written like hundreds of years before Jesus. But then it says, and you have to look a little symbolically here, it says, suddenly God himself is going to show up unexpectedly in the temple. And when he comes, and when he shows up in the temple, he's not going to be there to congratulate them on how great they're doing. Oh, your worship is just wonderful today. The songs were just amazing. And the sacrifices smell so good. No, it says here that he's going to show up and he's going to have some purifying to do. The things aren't going to be right, and his job at the temple is going to be to put them right. Now, I think there's deep, deep layers of symbolism here. But I think that what we see Jesus doing in the temple probably has deep, deep layers of symbolism too. So Jesus shows up and he says things aren't the way they're supposed to be. And he begins to cleanse and to purify and to refine the way that people are approaching God. See, Jesus cares about holiness. He gets passionate when places or things that are meant to be set apart for God are contaminated with other stuff. And he cares enough that he'll go on a rampage about it. He cares enough that he's going to come in with his whip. He's going to flip some tables, and he's going to say, no, this is not the way things were meant to be. Because Jesus is not just the good shepherd who goes after the sheep. He is that. But he's also the refiner's fire that burns away what's not pure, what's not holy. And so that's kind of my interpretation of what we can learn about God, what we can learn about Jesus here. Now, what about application? What does it mean to me? Well, when we think about application, maybe the first thing that would come to mind is the church, right? If Jesus showed up in the 21st century North American church, what would make him get his whip out? Right? You could probably name a few things. What would he want to drive out of our churches? Where would he want to flip a few things over? Where have we missed the point? Where are we off track? Where would he say, no, this is not what was intended? What would make him mad about the church today? And maybe make it a little more personal if he showed up at our door right now with his whip. What makes him upset about our church? What is it that we're getting wrong? Where is it that we're treating poorly, or we've been contaminated where we should be holy? And I think it's important to think about this because Jesus isn't just this sort of pushover, nicey guy who doesn't care about anything. This passage says he does care that he's passionate, and there are things that will get him riled up. But this kind of application, I think, is kind of cheap, because when we think about the church, we're often thinking about the people that bug us in the church, right? People who are more conservative are thinking about the liberals and how they've ruined things, and people who are more liberal are thinking of the conservatives and how they've ruined things. I don't mean politically, I mean in the church. And it's always easier to point out how other people are messing up. And so to say, what does it mean to me, I think it's really important to highlight that to me part. I'm sure that Jesus would have stuff to think or to fix about the church. But as I have reflected on this in the past week, where my mind keeps coming back to is this. The New Testament does say that the church that God is bringing together, he's building us together like a temple where he lives by his Spirit. And so to say that the parallel here is the church is permissible. What's the other thing that the New Testament says is like the new temple? Me, you, like our lives, our bodies, ourselves, that we are temples that God lives in by his Spirit. And so the other way to apply this, the other way to think about what this means, is to think about our own lives and to think about the fact that God has called us individually to be holy. Not to be perfect. Holy doesn't mean perfect. Holy means set apart, dedicated, given over to serving and worshiping God. And we're called to be holy. Actually, Hebrews 12:14 says that we should make every effort to be holy, because without holiness, no one will see the Lord. That somehow, in the same way that this temple, if you think of that temple in Jerusalem, was meant to be this physical, visible symbol that God was present, that God was there. And so it was supposed to be set apart for that. And there was even this court that outsiders could come in and see that God was present there. Maybe our lives are a little bit like that. That there's this inner court, this holy of holies where the Holy Spirit dwells inside of us. God himself has taken up residence. And in that place, we connect with him, we commune with him, we offer sacrifices. There's this incense of prayer that goes up before him. We talk to him, we build a relationship. But then we have kind of our outward life, which might be a little bit like the court of the Gentiles. This is where we come into contact with people on a regular basis. And this contact with people gives them a chance to be able to see that God himself is present in our lives. That when people kind of come into the circle of our life, they're meant to see a little bit of holiness, that our lives are set apart. And so if we can look at ourselves that way, if we can begin to understand that holiness is not something that the church is called to, but something I am called to, then maybe we can imagine Jesus showing up in our lives and saying, hey, there's some things you've allowed in the holy temple that is you that probably shouldn't be there, that are kind of messing this thing up. My Father's house wasn't meant to be a house of fill in the blank. And so I think the most important application to make here is to understand that Jesus comes into our lives with a bottle of wine and says, I'm here to bring you abundant life. I want you to enjoy the gift of life. But he also comes in with his whip. He also comes in like a refiner's fire. And he says, but there's some changes that need to happen. But I'm going to call you to a high standard. And we think, well, I'd rather have the wine Jesus than the whip Jesus, right? But they're two sides of the same coin. Jesus is only ever after our good and his glory through the wine and through the whip. Us becoming more holy isn't us becoming more miserable. It's us becoming closer to him and closer to what we were intended to be. And so this has been kind of powerful for me this week as I've reflected on it. I think it's an image I need to keep in my mind, this idea of Jesus showing up and saying, hey, stop doing this. Get these things out of here. So I want to just lead you into a bit of an imagination exercise, and then we're going to end with a couple songs that just allow you to sort of reflect personally on this. So I want you to imagine your life as a house with a bunch of rooms, okay? You can close your eyes if you want. Just sort of close your eyes and think of your life as a house. You're standing in it. There's the family room where you've got your family relationships. There's the TV room where you've got kind of the entertainment you enjoy. There's like the living room. You've got your social relationships, your friendships, the kitchen, the place, the heart of the social life and where you eat and drink. And you've got, a bunch of other rooms with different aspects of your life, an office where you're maybe symbolizing your work life. You've got the basement. It's where you put the junk you don't know what to do with in your life. The things you regret, the skeletons in your closet, you just throw them all down there and hope they'll go away, just like real stuff in my house. And you're just hanging out in there. You get a feel for this house as your life. And then the doorbell rings. And you show up, you go to the front door and you open it, and there's Jesus. And he's got a whip that he's made up just for you. And he says, we got some work to do. There's some stuff in here that doesn't belong in here because this is meant to be a holy space. And I don't want you just to think of him smiling and happy, because Jesus is passionate about this. He's passionate about God's temple that is your life, that is this place. He's zealous for you. He doesn't just love you a little bit. He loves you passionately and completely. And therefore, he doesn't just want a little bit of you. He wants the whole thing. What is it about your life that makes Jesus mad? Not mad at you. I'm not saying he's mad at you any more than he was mad at the temple back then. But is there stuff that has taken up residence in your life that you've allowed to enter that keeps you from holiness, that keeps you from that relationship with him that was intended, that keeps you from being a light to the world around you? Jesus is mad at that stuff, and he's willing to come in and drive it out and say, get it out of here. It doesn't belong. I'm going to read the scripture from Malachi again. I want you to continue just in an attitude of silent prayer as we begin to enter into some music. But just listen to this verse. And instead of picturing Jesus showing up in the temple back then, picture him showing up in your life. And what Malachi says, God says through Malachi, who will be able to endure it when he comes? Who will be able to stand and face him when he appears? For he will be like a blazing fire that refines metal, or like a strong soap that bleaches clothes. He will sit like a refiner of silver, burning away the dross. He will purify us, refining us like gold.